Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Engineering Moments podcast, where we discuss real life challenges facing software development teams from a leadership perspective. So, if you're a team lead, product manager, engineering manager, even director, playing any sort of leadership role within a development team, stick around. We'll have a lot of stuff for you. Today, on today's episode, we are talking about how teams adopt open source technology, some of the challenges they face, and no one better to join me in this discussion than my good friend Ijere. He's led lots of infrastructure projects over the years, and is particularly a specialist at Red Hat and OpenShift. So he's going to be giving us a lot of perspective from sort of the infrastructure side. And yeah, so over to you, IJ. Can you tell us a bit about just give us a small intro to the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Ugo, for the intro. I kind of feel I probably should have, shut off my camera before the intro, and then after the intro, turn on my camera and have like a bum, 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 bum,
Yeah,
bum,
yeah, maybe next time we'll
yeah,
have some animated confetti as well. So
yeah,
like,
definitely.
yeah, nice.
But thanks for that. That was pretty spot on. My name is Ijere. Um, I have same first and last name, so it was so good they named me twice, right? But if that's too hard, I mean, just call me IJ. I go by IJ. My friends and family call me IJ. So yeah, I've lived all my professional life managing infrastructures, primarily on the Linux platform. Most recently, been managing Red Hat OpenShift platforms, particularly for um, customers in the financial sector. So yeah, I have a pretty good grasp of infrastructure as well as how OpenShift kind of ties into that.
Right. Thank you very much. And I think a good place to start our conversation is, I mean, I'm from a software development background. I'm an engineering manager, and I think that one of the things that I've always felt from my teams and some of the feedback that I've gotten, especially when we try to adopt some open source technology, or when we're considering it, is that some of the tools can be tricky because of some of the learning curve that you need. So, is there anything in particular that you would advise engineering leaders to do, or how you go about it in terms of getting people to be more comfortable
Yeah,
in terms of onboarding and adopting open source technology?
that's a great question. I mean, there are different approaches, right, that leadership can take when considering adopting open source technology, particularly in the enterprise. I mean, you tend to find, for instance, startups who want to go nimble and get to market quickly, not really consider the factors that are necessary to make sure that the adoption of open source is mature, and just like go for it. And as it breaks, we figure it out and fix it, right? So it really depends on um, the state of your infrastructure, the business sector you're in. So a leader, engineering leader, CIO, CTO, who is in a well-established sector, for instance, the financial sector or the healthcare sector, where you have much more regulatory requirements that has to be met. OpenShift may not be your immediate go-to, right? But I mean, I've been on a lot of projects where um, the client, the customers, have a few OpenShift platforms. Sorry, a few open source platforms. Don't mind me. I spent my life
Yeah.
on OpenShift.
Put in a plug for OpenShift there.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I've seen customers who have a few open source platforms running in their environment. So I would say factors to consider. That's the most for me, the highest on the list would be what how mature is the open source tool or software or
Okay.
platform you're onboarding. And I tend to measure maturity by how active the community for that tool or software is, right? So as a leader, you don't want to onboard an open source tool that has, repository on GitHub with the last commit, say 5 years ago, right?
Okay.
That's very risky. So it doesn't have an active community, right? So uh, there will be bugs, and you wouldn't have, um, improvements, advancements, from the community trying to move that product forward. So that would be one: how active is the open source community that you're trying to onboard for the tool, and then secondly would be how it integrates into the rest of your tool set, right? Particularly those that are closed source, right? So if you're onboarding um, an IDP, for instance, like an identity provider, right? Um, that is open source. How does it integrate to your applications that need, identity management, right? So those are like kind of the two factors. I would put high on my list when considering adopting or onboarding an open source tool set or technology.
Okay. Thank you. I think that was very insightful. I particularly interested in the first thing you talked about in terms of maturity. But then there's something you talked about earlier on as well about, some startups that want to go nimble. So I have two sort of follow-up questions on that. So first of all, talking about being nimble, open source is sometimes seen as a way to save costs. I guess maybe for some startups, but from what I understand, there are actually some hidden costs
Yeah,
that you run into maybe in the long run. And so how should as a leader, how do you watch out or how do you
yeah,
gauge some of these things and future plan for them?
yeah, yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything, whether it's free in the sense of open source,
Hmm.
right, that comes with no cost, right?
Okay.
It is free to probably grab the tool set from a repository and install it on your platform, on your environment. But then what are the associated costs with keeping it running, right,
Hmm.
for whatever term that it stays running on your environment? So for instance, do you need to improve the code, right, while it's running on your environment? So you need the resource, right? So what language is it reading on? Do I need to onboard a new resource with that skill set? That's one. Secondly, would be I would say operational cost to deploying open source, and then the risk factor of that. So for instance, um, if for some reason, either the maturity level of the tool set or the project, or maybe the level of experience or expertise of the resource managing the tool set after it's been onboarded, um, if that is not handled very well, then it could open up um, some loopholes, right? So from vulnerabilities to bugs, where, you know, a negative impact of the tool set not running properly or
Hmm.
probably hijacked or taken advantage of can then create a cost to the business that runs into millions of dollars, right?
Hmm.
So those you know associated costs, right, is something you'd also have to look out for. How do I
Hmm.
keep the tool running, right? How do I keep it improved throughout the time we need it to run within our environment? So what kind of resources do I need? And also, because it's open, that means the source code is out there. How do we secure that source code for our environment so that, we don't have, bad actors taking advantage of maybe vulnerabilities or some, backdoors within the code?
Wow, okay, that's very interesting. Just to add on to this, are there any specialist skill sets that you need? Say your traditional development team is made up of developers, product managers, maybe QA,
Yeah,
designers. So you might have some people who are good in DevOps, some devs
yeah,
who are good in those areas, but they're most likely not specialists.
yeah,
So is that an additional cost, like a
yes.
specialist, or is it something that you can trust a dev who has good proficiency in sort of DevOps to handle?
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't really say that a an open source specialist exists out there, right?
Okay.
You could say someone is a specialist on an open source tool
Okay.
because of their level of expertise on the language that the tool is written on,
Okay.
right? So
Okay.
if it's a tool that is written, with Rust on, or maybe Ruby, or whatever language, right? You have to have someone on your team who has a good grasp of that language, enough to understand the underlying code, and have kind of a plan to build upon that code, right? Just to make sure that improvements, are happening at a particular cadence based on whatever your, internal, software lifecycle is within your company, right? So the
Mhm.
expertise or the specialist in quote would be someone who understands the language that the tool is written on.
Okay. Okay. So I think that helps.
Yeah.
Um, I think the second question I had was to do with maturity.
Mhm.
Now, there is this gray area with some of the open source tools like I know that I have had experience with, and how do you decide when to go with community-based supports versus paid supports? Because you know um, you eventually need some supports, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
what's the best way of making those sort of decisions?
Um, I'll say first regulation, right?
Okay.
So it's either your business functions within a sector that is highly regulated,
Okay.
or your business doesn't, right? So for some sectors, the regulatory body would say every single tool, every single platform must be an enterprise version. So that means it has paid
Okay.
support and a well laid out roadmap by the OEM for product improvement, right? Or if I'm not in a sector that, is highly regulated, the next factor to consider would be cost, right? So would it cost me as a startup to onboard a tool whose license per year it's maybe $50,000, right? Whereas there's an upstream, version of that tool that I can deploy and run, without having to spend a dime for the software, maybe not necessarily for the expertise to manage the software within the company, right? But at
Yeah.
least that greatly reduces your cost, right? Um, every other factor, in my opinion, kind of revolves around this too, right? So even with security, right? Um, open source tools that come with some level of enterprise support. So for instance, Red Hat's class of technologies, right? You will find an upstream open source version of Red Hat technologies, but then you're on your own on the deep end if you were to install those upstream open source versions, right? But as an enterprise, you can then say, okay, I don't want to install, let's say, OKD. So OKD is the upstream version of OpenShift, right?
Mhm.
I want to install Red Hat OpenShift. So that means you have to get subscription or support with Red Hat and a license, right? So that if something breaks within your installation or your environment, Red Hat swoops in and tries to fix your the bug or
Please
something,
do.
right? Right. Whereas, also Red Hat kind of guarantees that, that tool is constantly under R&D, so security errors, CVEs are constantly resolved, right? So those are the kind of the confidence that comes with the enterprise version. So really, why would you want to go with a paid version of a tool um, as opposed to the open source version would really be determined by, the regulation within the, sector you're running, the cost of the tool itself, um, and then again, how well it integrates with the rest of your environment, right?
Okay. But in the long run, is community support sustainable?
It is.
Okay, okay, go ahead.
It is. It is. I'm sorry to cut you off there. And the easiest example I can think of right now is the Kubernetes community, right?
Okay.
So the Kubernetes community, I think, is the largest open source community so far, and it's probably never gonna. I mean, the numbers keep on, going up, and that's because the tool itself, it's heavily adopted by everyone, right? So you find startups who have adopted, Kubernetes. You find larger organizations who have adopted Kubernetes. So everyone across sectors are actively contributing, right? So community support is very important for any open source tool, right? How relevant is it? It is to the tool? Really largely is dependent on the value that the tool brings, right? Um, so yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. I have two more questions. Um, so the next one, you talked a bit about enterprises and, and large companies, and also, like you say, with Kubernetes, you have startups um, picking it up and you have large companies picking it up as well.
Mhm.
So I want to talk about scale, right?
Yeah.
So in trying to sort of scale open source technologies, um, in both small and large companies or organizations, are there any specific hurdles that you've experienced or that you know of that you can sort of shed a light on in terms
Yeah.
of, again, from a leader's point of view?
Mhm.
I've adopted this open source and I have support. I have um, my team is sort of picking
Mhm.
it up.
Mhm.
Now I want to think about, okay, next 2, 3 years as we scale, we want to start making some long-term plans for our
Mhm.
technology. Are there any problems that come from
Yeah.
that come from having open source inside your tech stack that
Yeah.
you need to sort of game plan for?
Yeah. The example that immediately comes to mind, an interesting one, I think it is, um, would be, um, so I once worked on a project at a financial service providing customer, and they had adopted a particular tool. Um, well, in this instance, I mean, it has an open source version, but it was a Red Hat based tool technology. So the tool set runs on top of OpenShift, and OpenShift, it's kind of just the paid version or the supported version from Red Hat of Kubernetes, right? Um, Now there was a need to upgrade. So Calico is the network software that runs within OpenShift. Calico in itself is open source, right? Now, the customer wanted to upgrade the version of Calico because based on the release notes of the most recent release, it comes with functionality that they thought would be very useful for their, BGP networks within the environment. But the customer, every tool that has to be onboarded or upgraded has to go through a very rigorous security assessment, right? And that's a entirely different team, and this team, that team doesn't like the folks with that team. They don't crack a smile. I mean, when we jump on meetings with them, like it's either you meet every single security requirement, or they don't know about your tool, no matter how funny your jokes are on the call, right? So now we started. We got on the process of upgrading the tool, and then it passed all our lab, tests, and then we wanted to move it from lab to staging, and then from staging to production. Now, once it gets to staging, then the security team comes into, scan the entire like tool, and that would include like the code, scan um the images, the container images, right, that the tool also provides. Now, during the scan, a CVE was found. So CVEs are kind of security notifications of a bug, either within a code, within a software, or within an image, right? Now we looked through the CVE. It was for a library, I think it was a Ruby library. I'm not too sure. Within the image that provided the Calico software, the Calico tool, right? But Calico in itself wasn't using that particular library. So it's just like when you install, for instance, Ubuntu. Ubuntu comes with a bunch of libraries by default. And then I install, for instance, Apache HTTPD. It's not going to use those libraries existing on the operating system. I only need Apache, but because that library, one of those libraries, operating system libraries, has a CVE, has a vulnerability,
Mhm.
the security team does not does not pass that particular image, right? So that then meant that we had to figure out um, how to move past the approval for that particular tool being onboarded in the environment. Mind you, this is the open source version of that particular software, Calico. You don't control the speed of development for an open source community, right? You don't
Okay.
come into the community and go like, oh, there's a bug here. You guys need to fix it quickly. You're not paying them. So that's why you have the paid methods, right?
Okay.
So that was the first challenge, right? The second challenge was that um, we ran the risk of going outside our release cycles. So for the customer at that point, regulation stipulated that max there should be for the Kubernetes tool or open source platform that we're running. They had a max release cycle of 4 months, right? So that means every 4 months they have to move from whatever version of OpenShift they're running to the next version, right? So
Mhm.
this delays cost us to then run beyond that 4 months release cycle because security team wouldn't approve. That means our product wasn't validated for the next release. So that really just caused a whole lot of issues. And what then happened? Eventually, the customer decided to go with the paid version of Calico, right, from the Calico team, right?
Mhm.
So these are kind of gotchas that you
Mhm.
don't see when onboarding the tool, right? Up until you get to that point where it becomes a problem, right? And I find that, this is just one example. The main different scenarios that could play out in different ways. Those are some of the risks of onboarding, open source, particularly within the enterprise.
All right. Really good story. To be honest, you kind of um, answered two other of my questions within that story because I kind of had two final questions for you, and one was, wanting to know sort of because again, like you say, it's software development, and
Mhm.
sometimes shit happens, right?
Yeah.
So things don't work out the way you plan. So I wanted to know a bit about a time when you know something hasn't gone the way you
Mhm.
expect, which is
Mhm.
is what you're talking about. But I want to
Mhm.
come at this question from a different angle now.
Mhm.
Have you ever been in a situation where, again, you've onboarded a specific open source technology and you've used it for a while, but then it's just not working. It's not like it's not working, but it's not fit for purpose anymore for whatever reason. And then
Mhm.
you've had to take it out.
Mhm.
Have you ever been in that position, and how big of an impact, how much does that impact you in
Mhm.
terms of the the technology as a whole and sort of the team
Yeah.
itself having to, is it easy? There's some
Yeah.
things that are too so embedded in your
Yeah.
application, and then there's just, uh, yeah, just
Yeah.
what's your experience around this, if you have any experience
Yeah.
in this area?
Yeah. I have. At the end of the day, um, for me, it will be one, um, how much downtime that particular change is gonna create within your environment for the business. What does the business lose? So do they lose money or do they lose loyalty from their customer? Right. And then thirdly, how much toil does that create for your development team? Because again, you want to make sure that your development team, um, you're not creating too much toil for them, right? When it comes to the tool set that is available to them, right? But at the end of the day as well, like if something is not working, it's not working, right? There's no point kind of dragging like a dead horse just because, oh, we've spent so much time and effort to onboard this. Let's make sure we figure out a way to make it work. Sometimes it just wouldn't work, right? So I think the thing to do is to discover um, early enough when, okay, so the thing we thought was gonna, change our whole world within this platform, it's not doing that. It's actually doing the opposite. So realize that as quickly as possible. Create a new action plan. An action plan could include: do we consider another open source tool, right? Or do we just bite the bullet and go for, a closed source or at least a paid, um, an open source tool that has like support, right? From let's say a community or a vendor, right? And then thirdly would be, all right, so if we're going to do all this, whether a new open source tool or one with paid subscription or license, how much downtime and business impact is that going to have? And then what is the additional toil that it will create for development, right? And then figure out what outweighs the other, right?
Hmm.
So if the business impact is not really much, right? But the toil is higher for developers, then have that conversation with the development team, right? Let's try to figure out, okay, can we increase, work hours, or let's say, can we reduce your task on project A so that you can jump on this project B so that we can move it along quicker than, just having one person or two people working on it at a given time, right? Um, so yeah, those are the things I probably would consider. And yes, I've had a kind of an experience with that. It was back when I was supporting a customer who worked in the healthcare sector, and they used high performance computing, right? So initially coming on board, they were using a tool called I think PBS, if I'm not mistaken. So it was kind of an orchestration tool for HPC environments, but it didn't have the capabilities that they really wanted to see the platform have, particularly with how it provides additional features to their stakeholders, their own customers, right? But after analyzing, okay, this is what you want to achieve, you still want to remain an open source shop. What other tools are out there that are open source that we can onboard that would give you exactly what your customers are having right now, but plus the ones that capabilities that they need. So eventually we analyzed all that. It wasn't going to take a lot of downtime because um, we had kind of created a like an automation script around the deployment using Ansible, right? So that accelerated the time to market for that tool. And then eventually, the downtime to the business was just about 24 hours. So that was okay for them to swallow. So yeah, we're able to do that. And the result of that migration from, PBS to Slurm, I mean, has been amazing for the customer because we still keep in touch and they've built upon that tool. And I mean, the environment continues to run strong. So yeah, that's how I'll analyze, such scenario.
Yeah, happy ending, I guess, in the end. You're muted, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's really it. Thank you, Julian, for taking the time. The way I like to end this show is, first of all, do you have, I mean, if people want to reach you, people want to contact you, are you on socials, LinkedIn or Twitter or X,
Yeah.
whichever one you feel
Yeah.
comfortable sharing. If people want to
Yeah.
reach you, how should they?
Sure. I mean, you can reach me on LinkedIn, just search for IJ there. My handle, I think, on LinkedIn is actually IIJERE. So that's Ijere on LinkedIn.
Okay, nice. And I don't know. It's a really cold Saturday here.
Yeah.
What are you up to for the rest of the weekend?
Oh, my daughter is waiting downstairs. We're gonna do some baking downstairs for her, and then I'm sure throughout the day tomorrow will be a lot of confectionaries on the countertop.
Oh, nice, nice. That sounds like a good plan. Okay, thank you very much. See you next time, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, go. Bye, everyone.